All right, this is the first review video in the Good Life series. So we're starting out with a short video on psychological egoism, and then we'll get competing theories of the good life in the next few videos. A little bit of background. It's useful to distinguish between two types of desire, or two ways of wanting or desiring something. We can desire something instrumentally, which is desiring it as a means to, or for the sake of, something else. So you desire money because it's a useful tool to get you other things you care about. You can purchase things with money. By contrast, we can also desire something ultimately, or desire it as an end in itself, not because of what it can get you, or for its own sake. Psychological egoism is a descriptive thesis. It's a claim about the way human beings are actually set up. It's not a claim about what's right or wrong. It's not a claim even about the good life. It is instead simply a claim about the actual structure of human desire. Psychological egoism says the only thing anyone is capable of desiring or pursuing ultimately, as an end in itself, is his or her own self-interest. So psychological egoism, or as we'll be abbreviating it, PE, is a theory about the structure of ultimate desire in human beings. There's only one thing we're capable of desiring, or one kind of thing we're capable of desiring: our own self-interest. To the extent that you want anything else, you want it only instrumentally, for the sake of that ultimate end, which is your own self-interest. So we did a little sort of chart of your own desires, starting on the left with your desire to take this class. And what we found is that when we begin to ask, well, why is it that you want to take the class? We can give answers to that questions in terms of other things you value. Well, you want to get the degree, and we can ask, well, why do you want the degree? And the answer to that is probably pretty complicated. Part of it has to do with the job you can earn afterwards. Part of it might have to do with maybe another degree you want to get. You might also add, well, I also just want to be educated, right? But we can press on each of those and say, well, why do you want those things? And often, when we do this in a kind of naive way, what we find is we'll end up on the right-hand side of our chart with objects or ends that are related to your own self-interest. So you might get on the right-hand side to, well, because I want to be healthy. That's why I want a house, so that I'm not exposed to the elements. And when we press a little further and say, well, why do you want to be healthy? Either the answer is something like, well, that is part of being happy and I want to be happy, or you kind of don't know what to say. And you're sort of like, well, because being healthy is good, right? Or, you might also get to the right-hand side and find yourself saying, well, it's something about my enjoyment or my pleasure that really is the reason I want the education and the money and the house and all of that. And when somebody says, well, why do you want pleasure? It's kind of like, well, because it feels good for me, right? Or maybe something a little grander, like your sense of fulfillment. In each case, though, number one, it seems as if the things on the right-hand side of our chart are things we want for their own sake. And number two, it seems as if each of them fall under one umbrella, which is they are kinds of self-interest, or ways for things to go better for me, right? Whether it's my health, my pleasure, my enjoyment, my fulfillment, my happiness, it's about my interests. We even have on our chart family, right? Why is it that you want to support your family? Well, because I'd feel crappy if I didn't. That's basically the structure of desire according to the egoist. Notice the egoist doesn't yet tell us what self-interest consists in. Well, what is it for something to go in your interests? What we saw in this chart is that we had health and pleasure and fulfillment. We might even add virtue in there, actually, as a possible aspect of my self-interest. The egoist doesn't tell us which one of those, if any, is sort of chief and most important. That's instead what a theory of the good life is going to do. So the hedonist is going to say it's really pleasure that is what's in a person's interests fundamentally. The egoist, though, says, look, this is just how we're set up. We're fundamentally selfish in the following way. Everything we want and everything we do is ultimately motivated by a desire for our own self-interest. Plato tangles with a version of psychological egoism in the Republic. The main protagonist in the Republic is Socrates, who is his teacher. And it's written in the form of a dialogue, as we discussed. I had you read the beginning of Book 2 of the Republic, which is a really famous part of that work. And the characters at the beginning of Book 2 pick up with a discussion about justice. And for them, it's complicated, and if this were an ancient philosophy class, we would go into more detail in this and be a little more nuanced. But for them, justice means something like what we mean by moral virtue or morality, being good. So Socrates is asked, how is it, in what way do we desire justice? Like everyone here in the discussion that Socrates is having, everyone here agrees that we want to be just, right? We want to be good. But what kinds of desire do we have? Is this an ultimate desire or an instrumental one? And Socrates says this, I myself put it, that is justice, in the finest category. That is the one that anyone who is going to be blessed with happiness must love, both because of itself and because of its consequences. Leave out the because of its consequences bit. What matters for our purposes is that Socrates here claims that we ultimately, or at least are capable of ultimately desiring justice, which is not self-interest, but instead being good, doing good things for others, moral principle. We want to do that for its own sake. We ultimately care about it, so says Socrates. We desire justice or morality for its own sake. Notice that if Socrates is right about this, then our moral behavior, when you do something good for a friend, is not actually ultimately motivated by self-interest. At least sometimes. Perhaps it could be that sometimes you do good things selfishly, thinking you might get something in return. But Socrates' claim is that we're at least capable of sometimes just doing a good thing because we value the good thing, even if it doesn't bring us any benefit in the end. So moral behavior, when we do good things for one another, Socrates says, we're at least capable of being ultimately motivated by something other than our own self-interest. In other words, Socrates is rejecting psychological egoism here. And what then happens in the dialogue is that Glaucon, one of Socrates' friends and somebody who's learning from him as well, steps up and says, I'm going to play devil's advocate. So Glaucon doesn't actually believe that psychological egoism is true. But what he effectively says is, Socrates, I'm not going to let you get away with just throwing that out there and just being like, psychological egoism's false. We do care about morality for its own sake. Let's test it. Socrates is all about arguments. Let's put it to the test. Let's see if it stands up under scrutiny. And his idea, Glaucon's idea, is, we can't just look at our actual behavior. We can't just say, well, do I actually sometimes behave morally? Or do people sometimes behave morally? That's not enough to get at what our motivations are. Because the question isn't, do we sometimes behave morally? Nor is it, do we sometimes desire to behave morally? Instead, the question is, what are we ultimately motivated by? Why is it that we sometimes want to be moral and act morally? Glaucon's idea is that, when we look around in the actual world, our actual circumstances we find ourselves in, we live in a society that rewards some minimal amount of doing good and punishes doing bad to others. People who are antisocial, certainly people who are violent, are punished. We have laws against theft. We have laws against murder. We have laws against extortion. These are all ways of making sure that it is not in people's interests to behave immorally. And then we have some implicit ways of rewarding those who do good for others, making sure we incentivize morality. Glaucon looks at that and says, as a matter of fact, all of our good behaviors are kind of in our own interest in the end. So the fact that we're doing them doesn't actually tell us one way or the other whether it's the self-interest we're after or the morality or the justice. So what we really need to do is ask, how would we behave if it were no longer in our self-interest to behave justly or morally? The answer to that question will tell us what ultimately motivates our behavior, and so will tell us whether psychological egoism is true. So this is why we need to turn to a thought experiment for Glaucon, right? This is the Ring of Gyges story. The shepherd, Gyges of Lydia, finds this ring of invisibility. When he puts on the ring, he turns invisible and he realizes, hey, I can steal anything I want. I can use power however I want. And very quickly, he takes over the kingdom. He kills the king and takes the king's wife, and soon is ruling over the whole kingdom when just yesterday he was a shepherd. So his behavior changes radically once he realizes, hey, I'm invisible. Why? Well, because the invisibility, what it's doing is shielding him from accountability for wrongdoing. And it's taking away the usual incentives for doing good. You can't be seen when you're doing good if you've got the ring on. And it also removes the threat of punishment for immorality. You can't be seen if you're stealing, and so you don't have to worry about getting locked up. Glaucon's thought is, what this reveals is that not that the ring had a magical power to change Gyges' motives, that beforehand he was somebody who cared ultimately about morality, and then he put on the ring and it made him evil. No, actually, he cared all along only about his own self-interest. But before he put on the ring, it just so happened that his self-interest coincided with the right thing to do. And so that's why he went along with the usual way of doing things and didn't harm anybody. Once he puts on the ring, morality and self-interest come apart. And which does he choose? Well, he chooses self-interest. And this shows that Gyges' ultimate motivation is self-interest. He doesn't care about morality for its own sake, but just as a means to his own self-interest. Now, of course, this is not supposed to be like an odd little story about one person. The point that Glaucon is inviting you to consider is how anyone would behave if they found this ring. He says this, now no one, it seems, would be so incorruptible that he would stay on the path of justice, or bring himself to keep away from other people's possessions and not touch them, when he could take whatever he wanted from the marketplace with impunity, go into people's houses and have sex with whoever he wished, kill or release from prison anyone he wished, and do all the other things that would make him like a god among men. And in so behaving, he would do no differently than the unjust person, but both would pursue the same course. So you take the most moral person you can think of. We talked about moral saints in the class. You take a moral saint, you give them the ring. In a few days, they will have turned to complete immorality. Again, it's not transforming their motives, it's revealing them. What this thought experiment is supposed to show is that no one ever actually cared about morality ultimately. That was just a useful means that we used in ordinary circumstances to protect ourselves and to get what we want. When it's no longer in our interest to behave morally, so says Glaucon, you're kidding yourself if you think that you're going to keep volunteering with the Ring of Gyges on, or if you think that you're not going to steal things when you realize you can definitely get away with it. Glaucon's prediction is we would all behave immorally if we had the ring, and that means, so he claims, that we all are ultimately motivated by self-interest. So I think Glaucon is giving us an argument for psychological egoism. I'm going to put it in a slightly more general framework, because I think that the Ring of Gyges, while useful, it has its limitations in just its, fantasy nature, in that it's obviously fantastical. And if you're sort of like, what does this fantastical thought experiment have anything to do with real life? I think it's useful to recognize that there may indeed be some real life rings of Gyges that, although don't make you invisible, play the same functional role, or something very close to the same functional role as the Ring of Gyges. And what we'll do is define a kind of situation that plays that same functional role as this imaginary ring, and we can ask ourselves, how would we behave in that kind of role? Something a little more realistic, that kind of situation. So let's say that a Ring of Gyges type situation is any situation in which, 1, there are no rewards for moral behavior, and 2, there are no punishments for immoral behavior. That's like the functional role that the ring plays. And as we discussed in class, there may be non-fantastical rings of Gyges. Online anonymity may indeed be an example of a real life and contemporary shielding of oneself from punishment socially for bad behavior and lacking the incentive to do good. Wealth, power, we also talked about legal immunities. All of these count as, for our purposes, something like a Ring of Gyges type situation. Here's the Ring of Gyges argument, is what we can call it. This is the same form of argument that Glaucon is defending, and I think it's one that we should also just consider for ourselves whether we accept the premises. It's an argument for psychological egoism. So it's an argument that Socrates is wrong about justice. Here's the first premise. If I ultimately desire anything other than my own self-interest, then I would not behave immorally in a Ring of Gyges type situation. Here's the second premise. I would behave immorally in a Ring of Gyges type situation. And it follows validly, therefore, I do not ultimately desire anything other than my own self-interest. Now, you don't need to know the formal defense of the first premise that I have on the handout. We didn't get to it in class. Just if you understand the gist of why it's plausible, then that's enough. The first premise is basically just telling us that, look, if I cared about something other than myself, if I cared about moral principles or my friends for their own sake or justice or whatever, anything other than my own self-interest, then it wouldn't matter to me whether behaving morally was in my self-interest or not, because it was never the self-interest that motivated me. And that's why I would continue to behave in a morally upright way, or I would not behave immorally in a Ring of Gyges type situation, if indeed I ultimately desire anything other than my own self-interest. It's the idea behind the first premise. And Glaucon's prediction is premise 2, I would behave immorally in a Ring of Gyges type situation. It follows from this that psychological egoism is true. Now, I think that the second step is the most important one. And, if you think Glaucon's prediction about you is wrong, it's worth thinking about why. It's worth thinking about how you actually behave. Of course, you've never had the Ring of Gyges, but you do have access to the internet. You do sometimes, presumably, exist and communicate in online anonymous spaces. Does your behavior change? Do you get worse? Do you get a lot worse? Then Glaucon says, that's a lot of evidence in support of step 2. Likewise for other Ring of Gyges type situations. So I think each and every one of us can sort of only know with any certainty in our own case how we would behave. And even then, we might not know for sure. But I think it's worth thinking about, and that's the end of this first video.